Hi, it's Lori, and I'm here today with my husband Brett, his first time appearing in a video. And we're going to do a little bit of a book review and discussion on 3 different books. So we'll just get started with the books, and then I'll explain why he's the one who gets to be here with me. I did show these two in a video somewhat recently as books I was reading, and I explained that I was reading them together. And so that's kind of what we're doing in this video. So the first one is The Awakening of Miss Prim. This was written by Natalia Sanmartin. How did we decide?
I think we decided Fenollera.
Fenollera, probably. She's from Spain. And this novel came out in 2013. So it's basically a little bit of a Pride and Prejudice retelling, but it relates really well to the other 2 books we're going to talk about. So we'll get more into that later. Brett's read this once, and I think I've read this 4 times now, so I have issues.
I'm not much of a rereader.
Next up, we have the Benedict option. This is Strategies for Christians in a Post-Christian Nation by Rod Dreher. This one is a nonfiction book. Rod Dreher is a bit of a religion writer / pundit. Is that fair?
He started out as a religion journalist, and since then he's moved on to blogging and kind of cultural critique, less so than journalism.
Yeah.
His major source is the American Conservative website, is where he does most of his writing.
And this one came out in 2017. And then the final book we don't have a physical copy of because we have it on Audible, and that is Strangers in a Strange Land, Living the Catholic Faith in a Post-Christian World. And this is by Archbishop Charles J. Chaput, who is the Archbishop of Philadelphia now. He was the Archbishop of Denver for most of our younger years. And this one also came out in 2017.
So all 3 of these books kind of start with the premise, as you can tell from the subtitles of both Chaput's book and Dreher's book, that this is what they call a post-Christian world, or I guess Dreher says post-Christian nation. In Dreher's mind especially, that's more of the nation or the culture is hostile to Christianity. I would say in Chaput's mind it's more of we're kind of in a difference of opinion about what the goals of society are now. It's not necessarily quite as openly hostile.
And then with The Awakening of Miss Prim, we have our main character, Miss Prim, and she becomes the librarian for a man only known as the Man in the Wing Chair throughout the book. And the Man in the Wing Chair had a spiritual awakening a number of years before this. And so she is very skeptical, kind of the modern person coming into this situation with this man and the community that he's kind of built around him. So she kind of is standing in for that post-Christian world at the beginning and kind of learning about how the man in the wing chair came to faith and how that faith led him to create a community.
So there's some interesting parallels between the fictional world of The Awakening of Miss Prim and especially Archbishop Chaput's world. When Archbishop Chaput was in Denver, he had an auxiliary bishop named James Conley, who is now the Bishop of Lincoln, Nebraska. James Conley was not Catholic growing up, and he went to the University of Kansas for college, which is a secular university. While he was there, he was part of a program called the Integrated Humanities program that was run by a man named John Sr. And it was basically kind of a great books program. It dealt with the foundations of Western civilization. But because so much of the foundations of Western civilization, when you understand the motivation for art and culture, in so many cases were people's faith, and in particular at that time the Catholic faith, Even though it was being taught in a secular university, they had a lot of people suddenly start converting to Catholicism that were
Yeah.
part of the program.
The program started pretty small, and it got to be like 100 and almost 200 students towards the end. And over the course of the amount of time, it wasn't really around for very long. I would say maybe a decade or less that this program was in existence. There were 100 people from the program who converted to Catholicism. So
And
they actually launched an investigation to see if there was proselytizing going on. They found none of that, but they did end up closing down the program in large part because there was this concern about so many people converting in the program.
but so Bishop Conley wound up converting and becoming a priest and eventually a bishop and going to Denver and working under Archbishop Chaput. So Archbishop Chaput is very familiar with the role of the integrated humanities program in Bishop Conley's life. In the awakening of Miss Prim, what was sort of the awakening of the man in the wing chair.
It says in the book that he went to a seminar in Kansas. So it's a little bit vague, but the author, Natalia Sanmartin
Fenollera.
Fenollera, I'm never going to be able to pronounce that.
Later on, she's explicitly said she was referring to John Sr.
Yeah.
and the Integrated Humanities Program.
Yeah, and I will try to link. There's a really good talk she gave at Clear Creek Abbey in Oklahoma. It's subtitled. She's speaking in Spanish, but there are English subtitles because she's just a lot more comfortable speaking her native language. It is a translated book, so I think it was pretty well translated. But
So in a lot of ways, the awakening of the man in the wing chair came from the same source as the awakening of Bishop Conley and a number of other people who are now pretty major players in the world of Catholicism, at least. As a side note, Bishop Conley has now started kind of something modeled on the Integrated Humanities Program in the Diocese of Lincoln.
I think we'll get started with one of these three books that I think both of us believe is probably the weakest of the three books. Are you going to agree that Benedict Option by Roger has some good points, but doesn't make the case as well as the other two, including the fictionalized account?
And I think it's more readable. His style of writing is more engaging than, for example, Archbishop Chaput's, who is really just kind of straightforward and uses no figurative language hardly at all. It's bullet point. It literally is bullet points throughout a lot of the book.
You could very easily outline while you were listening to Strangers in a Strange Land. You could pretty well outline the book as you went. I feel that's the way with all of Archbishop Chaput's writing. I remember Render Under Caesar, another book he wrote probably a decade or more ago, also being very like point after point.
And Dreyer started out as a professional writer, and he's a more imaginative writer than Archbishop Chaput. He uses a lot of figurative language. In fact, the name, the Benedict Option, refers to Saint Benedict being the father of monasticism and starting the big abbeys that are so famous throughout, like when you think of the Middle Ages and the abbey being the center of the community, that whole movement was started by Benedict.
And so it's kind of interesting. The Benedict Option basically argues that one of the things we should consider doing is living by kind of a rule almost. And he points out some different communities that are doing this, that are smaller communities that are living by some sort of rule. He does go to a Benedictine abbey in
one in Italy and
Norcia.
Right,
Nurcia.
Yeah.
It's the same town. It has different names, and it's referred to in the Benedict Option and in the Awakening of Miss Prim, and that's where Benedict was originally from. So he goes and he learns about their rule and how they live, and so that's a portion of what he has to talk about.
And then he meets a community of Italians nearby who, more or less, do what he's encouraging people to do, is to form these small networks and encourage one another. And he talks about sort of being leaven to the rest of the wider world, but sort of in the first instance to look out for their own kids and their own traditions, and to let that be an example to the wider world.
But one of the big criticisms of that is that a lot of people, because of some of the figurative language he does use when he's writing, see it as him telling people to kind of detach from the world and like just totally remove themselves.
I think his analogies get pretty sloppy and confusing, especially when it's being put out there to a pretty wide audience. I think he actually kind of writes to more of like the American evangelical part of
Yes.
Christianity.
Yeah, his writing definitely is not to a niche market. Like Archbishop Chaput is writing mostly for Catholics. I mean, most people aren't going to pick up a book by an archbishop if they're not Catholic, or at least interested in what Catholics have to say. Whereas Rod Dreher, a lot of what he does in the book is, of course, he's talking to a lot of Catholics because he's going to like these Benedictine communities and so forth, but he's also talking to evangelicals and mainline Protestants. So he is trying to reach like a cross section of all of the Christians in America, and he focuses very specifically in on America in this. He does go to Italy and things, but his argument is we need to do something here, and it's very American focused.
And ultimately, his argument is the first purpose of the book is to be a wake up call to Christians about how toxic he thinks the culture is to Christianity now. So the underlying message is really one of fear, I think, in the Benedict option.
And I also think that he's pretty sloppy in what he says is he points to these things and says, "Oh, this is the worst it has ever been, and no other time in history has it been like this." But like you're sitting there going, really, like ancient Rome, Greece, like none of this is occurring to you as similar to some of the things you're talking about now. So I thought he was a little sloppy in his fear mongering, personally.
And then, so one of his big metaphors is that these Benedict communities that he talks about are an ark, that we're building arks to protect the future of humanity. But with Noah in the ark, that biblical story, they knew when the rain was over, they knew when the flood started to recede. They got a branch back, when they sent out a bird to find some kind of proof that the flood was over. He doesn't go into any of that about how we know when we can stop retreating and come back into society. So it's kind of like a permanent retreat in a way. He's been probably the most successful of the three, at least in the United States, in terms of reaching a broader audience. So it's a pretty influential book. And I think that you can say that's for better or for worse in some ways.
Yeah. Oh, and I guess one more thing I do want to say about Rod Dreher as an author and a person is that he has been kind of on a path seeking. Okay, so I guess I'm going to go back to there are three major concerns that great books programs and that Christians often point to, and those are truth, beauty, and goodness. So he's been on the hunt for truth, beauty, and goodness. You can tell that in his writing. But he's really struggled. So he has been an evangelical Protestant, and he's been a Catholic, and he is currently an Orthodox, Eastern Orthodox Christian. So he kind of has been jumping from place to place to place, trying to find community. And I feel like the book is telling of that. Like he has spent years trying to find his place, and right now he thinks he's found his place, although a few years ago he also thought he had found his place when he converted to Catholicism. So I think that the book kind of jumps around and does this retreat thing because that's what he personally has been trying to do out of a very good place, trying to find these great things. But I think it has kind of complicated his work a little bit, that he himself is not yet rooted in anything very well.
About the same time that I read both the Benedict option and Archbishop Chaput's book, our priest at our local parish had just come back from Guatemala, and he gave a homily that talked about the way they grow coffee in Guatemala is they graft the head of the plant that produces better fruit onto the stem of a plant that has deeper, stronger roots. And I think if you use that metaphor to talk about Rod Dreher's book, he has really good fruit in some respects, but it's pretty shallowly rooted. And then do you want to go ahead and move on to Archbishop Chaput now?
Yeah, I think Archbishop Chaput has much deeper roots there.
Yeah, Chaput grew up in a small town in Kansas. He thinks and acts like somebody from
A small town.
a small town in Kansas. He's straightforward. He knows what he believes, and there's not much wishy-washiness about him. And
There's a firmness there.
And I think, while he does have good fruit, like talking about his writing style, it's not that imaginative. It's not going to be in broad publication like Dreher's.
It's not going to be something that you're going to be like, ooh, I can't wait to pick up Archbishop Chaput's book again. It's going to be the sort of thing where you're like, okay, I'm going to read a chapter a day because it's good for me, not because it's the most entertaining thing you've ever come across.
But it's firmly rooted, so you know that he's not going to be confusing with his analogies the way Rod Dreher was, and then have to come back and say, oh, no, you're misinterpreting what I said. I didn't mean that you should run off to the hills and retreat from the world, even though over and over he says almost that.
Yeah. So Archbishop Chaput's book,
he starts with somewhat of the same premise, that the world, and I think he in his subtitle is the world.
yeah, he's talking a little more globally than, and it's interesting because Rod Dreher is taking the whole world and trying to apply it to America. So he's taking all these examples from Italy and wherever, and trying to say this is what we need to do here. Whereas I don't feel like Archbishop Chaput spent a lot of time looking at like the whole world. It was more like starting small and going out rather than starting big and funneling down. Just different approaches, I guess.
And he does go maybe a little more into the history that Lori talked about with, Dreher is like, this is the worst it's ever been. Well, Chaput goes throughout history a little more, and one of his major sections is a letter to, I believe it's Diocletus. I
think so.
I already forgot it, but it's about an 1800-year-old letter that talks a lot about the role of Christians in a world that doesn't really appreciate Christians. And that letter uses a lot of figurative language that Archbishop Chaput never would. He says, Christians are to the world what the soul is to the body. And even though the body at times may hate the soul because it restricts the kind of pleasures that are licit to receiving that body, the world might hate Christians, but that's a role that God has put Christians into. And so while deprivation, like fasting and that kind of thing, or redemptive suffering, can be harmful to the body and yet be good for the soul, the kind of suffering that Christians may go through in the world will ultimately be better for both the world and for Christians. And so he has that rootedness in history and maybe more perspective about, it might be bad now, but it's been bad before too. And Christianity, with the Beatitudes and just in general the idea of Christian love, has had and will continue to have the tools to get through the hard times. So it's much less rooted in fear than the Benedict option.
One thing that's similar is they both talk about having to maybe pull back a little bit in a sense. Now, Rod Dreher, it almost feels like he's saying you need to pull back, build a whole community of like-minded people, and basically try to live in your little bubble. But Archbishop Chaput points out that being Christian in a nation that is moving away from Christianity being kind of like the common theme, so America is a very Christian nation from its very beginning, and we had that in common. So, kind of the Christian morality was common. And now we're getting to the point where a lot of people are moving away from a Christian morality. And so, this is causing problems with people's. If you are a practicing Christian, and if you do believe in Christian morality, more and more like careers and like jobs are going to be closed to you if you intend to live within a Christian morality. And so he just kind of states, like we have to be okay with the fact that we will have fewer options. So it's kind of a pulling back, but it's not a pulling back and trying to hide. It's a pulling back and saying, okay, to keep within our moral expectations, we may not be able to do certain things in society.
More of a, excuse me, keeping engagement wherever possible, but keeping that in a principled way rather than digging a bunker and just disengaging more and more completely. So should we move on to The Awakening of Miss Prim
Yes.
now?
Yep.
So this is a novel, and so right at the beginning, that's a major difference between the two nonfiction books.
Yes.
It's funny because it was actually published the first of the three books, even though later on when Rod Dreher kind of discovers it, he calls it a novelization of the Benedict option. And could argue that the Benedict option is a non-fictionalization of The Awakening of Miss Prim.
Although he had not been aware of the book at the time he wrote the Benedict option.
So it's basically a retelling of Pride and Prejudice with kind of a romance story between Miss Prim and the man in the winged chair. And the setting is a small community in Spain that, in a lot of ways, is what Rod Dreher would later term a Benedict community. It's a group of people that have come together from really all around the world and live and work together because they have the similar worldview and similar passions that actually are very much in keeping with the integrated humanities program that we talked about earlier. And it happens to be centered around a Catholic abbey in Spain.
So the man in the wing chair is kind of the catalyst for this community. He, once upon a time, was not religious at all. He's a brilliant scholar and well known as a man of languages. He knows all sorts of languages that nobody knows. So that's kind of what his background and training are. And he ends up going to a seminar in Kansas, as it says, and comes back. And this is actually the community that he grew up in, the location. So he comes back to his family's house and he wants to reopen it because it's a big, fancy, whatever kind of house. And he starts kind of going to the abbey and getting to know one of the priests there. And so he ends up kind of building the community around him. So like-minded people start to come. And so a lot of the people in the community have a lot of qualifications for different things, but that's not necessarily what they're doing there. They kind of start businesses or whatever that the community needs. So, you might be a journalist by education, but you're you end up being a florist because the community didn't have a florist yet. So it's kind of an interesting, kind of reminds me of Archbishop Chaput saying that we might have to not be in certain careers. Not that it's exactly the same thing, but these people are coming in, a lot of them highly educated, and just doing really random things. Another major part of the story is how the people of San Ireneo, which is the name of the little town, educate their children.
So the man in the wing chair, it's his niece
His
and nephew, right? Or
Yeah, I can't remember. There's several children. One of them's definitely a girl, and there's at least two boys. There are often a lot of children in the house, so it's kind of hard to keep track of which ones are his nieces and nephews. But he's raising them because his sister passed away.
and as a community, they've decided to have a school, but it's there's not compulsory education per se in that community. They send the kids to school because there are certain things that they want them to be able to learn from somebody besides their parents. But a lot of people, including the man in the wing chair, do a lot of their education at home. And it happens to be, in his case, because he is kind of comes from a great books background, he very much focuses on great books style education.
And so when Miss Prim first comes in, she overhears him having a lesson with the kids, and he's asking them who wrote something, and he's speaking Latin, and so he wanted them just from the words to be able to figure out which author it was. So Miss Prim is a little disturbed by his educational methods to begin with. The school in town basically is an interesting thing because they weren't trying to hire the best and brightest of the teachers. And so the teacher is just kind of an average lady that's the teacher at the school. And mostly people send their children there to learn how to read and write and do a little bit of arithmetic. And then everything else is either done at home or by different people in the community. So seems like one of the people gives like botany lessons and somebody else does something else.
And I'm not sure if we've said this, but Miss Prim actually comes into the community because she answers an advertisement that the man in the wing chair had placed in a newspaper, looking for a private librarian. He has such a large collection of his own that he needs somebody to help organize it.
And he leaves books everywhere unless the children wander around with them. So his library is a mess. And one of the qualifications he asked for in his advertisement was like he didn't want somebody with qualifications with an education
in library science.
Yeah, he was not looking for that. Miss Prim, however, is highly qualified in a lot of ways, but she answers anyway. And in the end, he ends up accepting her as the librarian. So she moves into the community, into this big manor house type thing, and starts to sort out his library. But she has no idea what she's gotten into. She doesn't understand the community at all at first. And so throughout the book, you as the reader are learning what this community is through the eyes of Miss Prim, who's coming in with no understanding of anything to do with the community.
And being a romance, of course, gradually they fall in love with one another. They have an estrangement where his pride and her prejudice lead them to be separated for a time. She goes actually to Italy to live for a while, kind of at the suggestion of his mother, right?
Yes, the man in the wing chair's mother has this thing about all women need to spend some time living in Italy to be properly educated. So when she wants to get away, it's just a handy excuse that she comes up with, like, oh, I need to go to Italy. So
I could be remembering this wrong, but I think another parallel is that she actually travels to Nursia.
Yes, so there's an old lady who, when she finds out she's going to Italy, says you need to go to Nursia. I know a monk there, and Miss Prim is kind of angered that this lady suggests she goes there.
She's a very secular person to begin with.
Yeah, she doesn't like religion at all. And she's just like, why are people wanting me to run their errands? But in the end, she travels all throughout Italy, and she ends up ending her travels in Nursia. And there you kind of find that she's always analyzing and dissecting all of the literature, and the man in the wing chair doesn't approve of this at all. But when she gets to Italy, all she can do is recite poetry, and she can't analyze it. She can just recite it. And so you find her at the end in Nursia reciting poetry, and kind of coming into a sense of faith, because the big estrangement between Miss Prim and the man in the wing chair is religion, because as the man in the wing chair puts it, if you and I both want to go to the Russian steppes, we can go together, and but we might not get along very well along the way. But what if you want to go to the Russian steppes and I want to go to Tahiti? So just saying, we're just so far apart. So basically, we find a whole new Miss Prim, one that's been awakened through her experiences, both in the community of San Ireneo and in her travels throughout Italy. And
I don't think it necessarily. Now you've read it more times than I have. I'm trying to remember the ending. It kind of leaves it open as to like she's come back.
The ending, she's leaving Nursia. She has found out that the man in the wing chair, based on an advertisement that's very similar to the one that she answered, is looking for a teacher. And that prompts her to tell the hotel that she needs to leave, and she leaves. And it ends with the last paragraph has a little bit of French in it. I'm not going to try the French because my French is terrible.
Well, in fact, is it French or Italian now? I'm not positive, but it's poetry, right? It's a line from poetry.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure it's French.
And she's explaining why she's going back in a way, and it's l'amore che muove il sole et le altre stelle, love that moves the sun and the other stars.
Okay, it might be Italian. I thought it was French, but now that I look at it, it looks Italian. But anyway, the love that moves
the sun and the other
sun
stars.
And the other stars. So she has come to an awakening herself, and they never reunite in the book. You're left to believe what you want to believe, like where's she going. It doesn't say. It certainly implies that she has gotten to the point where she's ready to go to Tahiti with the man in the wing chair, as the kind of like they could go somewhere together because they now have more of a parallel understanding of each other. So I think the awakening of Miss Prim is a very microcosm version of what is suggested in the Benedict option, and to some extent in Strangers in a Strange Land, because Miss Prim is coming to this understanding. I actually think it might be the easiest way for someone who is not Christian to understand the concept of the Benedict option and Strangers in a Strange Land, because it's coming from that more secular perspective of the main character experiencing things.
As far as the writing style, it's a beautiful story, and I think some of it may be lost in translation, might be part of why at times it seems a little clunky, but the hardest thing for me with it was she packed so many ideas into it in a pretty simple romantic story. She talks about the influence of Tolkien and the Inklings. She talks about Chesterton, Belloc, that group of thinkers. John Senior and the Integrated Humanities program. Cardinal Newman's oratory. So it's pretty, for being a little love story, it has a lot of kind of lofty ideas floating around in there.
But that's what makes it good to reread 4 times, because each time you can pick up more. And one of these days, I'm going to get around to reading through it and writing out all of the works of literature that are referenced in there. I mean, the references Dostoevsky and the Aeneid, and like you just name it, it's probably in there. Because I think it would be interesting to see if you could read all the things in this book.
And I think as far as in relation to the Benedict option and Strangers in a Strange Land, even though like Rod Dreher has kind of claimed it as his own, saying, she talks so clearly about a Benedict community, it's exactly what I'm talking about. In the end, and literally in the end of that story where she talks about the love that moves the sun and the other stars, while Dreyer's book to me is more about fear, Archbishop Chaput's book ultimately is more about love, and like we have the tools to get through it, and it's love, and that's what her ultimate, where she comes down on the awakening of Miss Prim. The point ultimately is the power of love.
Anything else you want to add before we close up?
No, I appreciate Lori having me on here to talk about this because it's been kind of a fun conversation.
You can tell who the brainiac in the household is. So, thanks very much for watching. Please let me know if you've read any of these books in the comments or if you're interested in them. Or if you have other book suggestions along this vein, that would be great. And I will see you next time. Thanks. Bye.